This is background Nippon. There is nothing here that needs your attention. What follows is Japanese history told slowly for the end of the day. The lanterns are lit. There is a particular color that belongs only to a few weeks in March and April. It is not quite white and not quite pink. It is the color of things that are about to be over. You find it at the edges of parks, along riverbanks, lining the approaches to temples that have stood for 1,000 years and expect to stand for 1,000 more. You find it in the branch of a single tree outside a window, in a neighborhood that has no other remarkable feature, and you stop walking. The Japanese call this season Hanami. The word means simply flower viewing. It is an activity precise enough to be planned months in advance, and vague enough to mean almost anything. A picnic under a tree, an emperor's garden party, a cup of warm sake held in both hands while petals fall into your hair. It happens every year. It has been happening for well over 1,000 years. And still, when the blossoms come, the country stops. Japan is one of the few countries in the world with an official cherry blossom forecast. Every year in late January or early February, meteorological organizations begin tracking temperatures across the archipelago, calculating when the blossoms will open in each region. The forecast is broadcast on national television, printed in newspapers, and displayed in train stations alongside the weather. It is treated with the seriousness of a typhoon warning and the anticipation of a festival calendar. The front moves northward. Kyushu first, where it is warm, then Honshu, then the north, where in Hokkaido the blossoms may not open until May. The country watches the map like a slow tide coming in. People plan around it. Trains are booked. Picnic spots are claimed days in advance, and then the blossoms open and everyone goes outside. And for a few weeks, the country is, in some essential way, the same country it has been for a very long time. There is a concept in Japanese aesthetics for the particular feeling the blossoms produce, mono no aware. It is usually translated as the pathos of things, or sometimes the bittersweet awareness of impermanence. Neither translation is quite right, but both point in the right direction. The cherry blossom is beautiful because it does not last. This is not a consolation. It is the point. A flower that bloomed year-round would be a different kind of beautiful, dependable, reliable, something you could return to. The sakura is beautiful in the way that a clear evening in late autumn is beautiful, precisely because you know what comes next. The 8th century poet Mennioshu knew this. The court ladies of the Heian era knew this. The soldiers who flew into the Pacific with cherry blossom emblems painted on their planes knew this, though they used it differently. To watch the blossoms is to practice gently the awareness that everything ends. The Japanese have been doing this for a very long time, and they have become quite good at it. The cherry blossom was not always the flower of spring. In the earliest Japanese poetry, the blossom that mattered was the plum. The plum tree flowers earlier in the year, in February and sometimes January, when the air is still cold and the ground has not fully thawed. Its flowers are smaller than the cherry, less spectacular, and they smell a sweet, faint scent that carries in cold air in a way that warmth disperses. The Mennioshu, the oldest surviving anthology of Japanese poetry, compiled in the 8th century, contains over 120 poems about the plum blossom and only 44 about the cherry. The plum had been introduced from China, where it was a symbol of elegance and scholarly virtue, and the Nara court, which modelled itself closely on the Tang dynasty, adopted it accordingly. Flower viewing parties in this period meant plum viewing parties. The court went outside in early spring, composed poems about the blossoms, and drank rice wine. The tradition was already there. The flower would change. The shift from plum to cherry happened gradually across the 9th and 10th centuries, as Japan moved away from its direct imitation of Tang China and began developing a more distinctly Japanese court culture. The aesthetic preferences shifted. The cherry blossom, native to Japan, more dramatic, more overwhelming in full bloom, began to displace the plum in poetry and in ceremony. By the time the Kokin Wakashu, the first imperially commissioned anthology of Japanese poetry, was compiled in 905, the word hana, flower, unqualified, was already understood to mean cherry blossom. No other flower required that level of assumption. The cherry had become the flower. The plum did not disappear. It still flowers every February, and Japanese people still notice it, and it still has its own traditions and its own poetry, but it no longer stood at the center. Something had been quietly displaced, and the displacement was permanent. The world that made cherry blossom viewing into a high art was the Heian court at Kyoto. From roughly 794 to 1185, Japan was governed loosely and with considerable chaos from a capital called Heian, the city of peace and tranquility, which is now Kyoto. The court that gathered there was small, highly educated, obsessed with aesthetics, and deeply interested in the natural world as a source of poetic material. Flower viewing parties were court occasions. The emperor would gather nobles, poets, and musicians beneath the blossoming trees of the palace garden. Poetry would be composed and exchanged. The beauty of the blossoms, the lateness of the season, the inevitability of their falling, all of this was material for verse. The women of the court were among the most accomplished writers of the era. Murasaki Shikibu, who wrote The Tale of Genji in the early 11th century, often described as the world's first novel, filled her book with cherry blossoms. The blossoms mark the seasons of the narrative. They fall at the moment of longing, at the moment of loss. They bloom again when something begins. She understood exactly what they were for. The Tale of Genji is not a book about cherry blossoms. It is a book about love, power, beauty, aging, loss, and the particular sadness of a world arranged entirely around aesthetic perfection. But the cherry blossoms are always there, marking time, announcing season, providing the emotional register for whatever is about to happen. In one of the novel's most famous scenes, Genji hosts a spring gathering beneath the blossoms. The party is elaborate, the poetry is accomplished, the occasion is a display of everything the Heian court valued, and yet underneath it, something aches. The blossoms are falling. The moment is ending even as it is happening. The gathering is most beautiful at the instant it begins to become a memory. Murasaki Shikibu was writing about her own world, a world she understood to be passing even then, even at its height. The novel was finished around 1021. The Heian period ended in war and chaos in 1185. The cherry blossoms were still there. In the spring of 1598, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the most powerful man in Japan, held a flower viewing party. He was 62 years old. He had unified the country after a century of civil war, had attempted twice to conquer Korea, and had arranged the succession of power with the careful, suspicious attention of a man who had come from nothing and intended to keep what he had built. He was also dying, though he did not say so. The party was at Daigoji Temple, south of Kyoto in the hills. Hideyoshi had ordered 700 cherry trees planted on the hillside for the occasion. He had invited 5 nobles, 900 guests, 300 concubines and ladies in waiting, and his own family. He arrived in a palanquin. The party lasted a full day. Poetry was composed. Food was served. The blossoms were, by all accounts, spectacular. Hideyoshi died 5 months later, in September. The party at Daigoji was the last major public event of his life. He had arranged 1,000 cherry trees and 900 guests and a day of poetry. And then he died, and his successors began fighting, and everything he had built lasted another 15 years before the Tokugawa ended it. The cherry trees at Daigoji are still there. They bloom every spring. What Hideyoshi understood, and what the Heian court had understood before him, was that flower viewing was not simply an aesthetic occasion. It was a display of power. To host a Hanami party of any scale required land, resources, influence over the calendar of those invited, and the ability to command the attendance of people who had other things to do. The blossoms set the date. You could not choose when the flowers opened, but everything else was arrangement, and arrangement was dominance in polite form. The warlords of the Sengoku period, the century of civil war that preceded Hideyoshi, had understood this. They built gardens. They planted trees. They held parties. War and aesthetics were not opposites in this world. They were two expressions of the same ambition. Hideyoshi's Daigo Hanami was a statement. This is my Japan, these are my trees, these are my blossoms, and you are all here because I invited you. He made it beautiful, because beauty was the most refined form of that statement. After Hideyoshi's death and the subsequent wars, Japan passed into the hands of the Tokugawa shogunate. The Tokugawa period, 1603 to 1868, was by the standards of Japanese history extraordinarily stable. The country was unified, largely at peace, sealed from most foreign influence under the Sakoku policy, and governed by a bureaucracy that had 2.5 centuries to develop its habits. The capital moved to Edo, the city that would become Tokyo, and it grew. In the 17th century, it was perhaps the largest city on earth. By the 18th century, it had a sophisticated urban culture, theaters, printmakers, novelists, restaurants, shops selling specialist goods to a population with leisure time and disposable income. And in the parks and along the river banks, cherry trees. The 8th Tokugawa shogun, Yoshimune, is credited with one of the most consequential acts of landscape gardening in Japanese history. In the 1720s, Yoshimune ordered cherry trees planted along the Sumida River and at Asukayama, north of the city. His reasoning was practical as well as aesthetic. The rice paddies and fields that surrounded the city were producing crops, and the farmers who worked them were not to be disturbed. Flower viewing needed somewhere to happen, so he gave it somewhere. The trees he planted were primarily Yoshino cherries, a variety that produces masses of pale pink blossoms before the leaves emerge, the variety that most people now picture when they imagine sakura. The effect was to move Hanami from the estates of the powerful to the banks of a public river. Anyone could go. Anyone did. The commoners of Edo spread out along the river in enormous numbers, brought food and sake, sang and argued, and fell asleep under the trees. Flower viewing had been democratized. It has remained democratic ever since. Almost every cherry tree you see during Hanami is the same tree. The Somi Yoshino, named for the village of Somi, now absorbed into the Tokyo suburb of Toshima, is a cultivar developed by nursery growers in the Edo period, probably in the mid-19th century. It has pale, almost white blossoms with a faint flush of pink. It flowers before the leaves emerge, so in full bloom, The branches appear to be made entirely of petals, and it flowers spectacularly, not one flower at a time, but all at once, a mass event that lasts roughly 2 weeks and then ends. The Some Yoshino does not reproduce true from seed. It is propagated by grafting cuttings from one tree attached to the rootstock of another. This means that every Some Yoshino in Japan is, genetically, the same tree. Clones. When you look at a row of cherry trees along a river in Tokyo and another row outside a castle in Hirosaki, you are looking at the same organism, repeated. This explains, in part, why the cherry blossom forecast works. The trees respond to temperature in largely the same way. They open together because they are, in a meaningful sense, one. The cherry blossom opens according to accumulated warmth. In winter, the buds are present but dormant, waiting, in the language of botanists, for enough cold hours to break their dormancy. Once that threshold has been met, the buds begin responding to warmth. Each day above a certain temperature adds to their progress. When enough warmth has accumulated, they open. This is why the forecast works, and also why it can be wrong. An unusually warm winter means the buds may not have been sufficiently chilled. A cold snap in March can delay the opening by days. A period of warmth followed by cold, followed by more warmth, produces a kind of negotiation between the tree and the season that the meteorologists must follow in real time. Climate change has already shifted the average bloom date in Tokyo by about a week since records began in the 19th century. Some years the blossoms now come in late March instead of early April. The forecast must account for a climate that was not there when the first measurements were taken. The peak of the bloom is called mankai, full bloom. Every blossom on the tree open. It lasts, in a typical year, between 1 and 2 weeks. Then the petals begin to fall. The falling has its own name, Hanafubuki, cherry blossom blizzard. When the conditions are right, a warm day, a slight breeze, a tree at the exact moment between peak bloom and the first falling, the air fills with petals. They move like snow in slow motion, drifting rather than dropping, catching the light as they descend. They cover the ground, cover the water of rivers and ponds, settle in the hair of anyone standing underneath. Most people rate this as highly as the bloom itself. In some ways more highly. The falling is the thing that makes the bloom meaningful, the proof that it was temporary, the evidence of what mono no aware actually feels like when you're inside it rather than thinking about it. You stand under the tree. The petals fall. You understand something that is almost impossible to explain to someone who has not stood there. There is a mountain in Nara Prefecture that has more cherry trees than almost anywhere else on earth. Yoshino. The mountain has been a sacred site for more than 1400 years. The temple at its summit, Kinpusen-ji, is one of the great centers of Shugendo, the mountain asceticism that blends Buddhist practice with older animist traditions. Pilgrims have been climbing the mountain for centuries, and for centuries the trees have been here. The cherry trees of Yoshino are not Some Yoshino. They are older varieties, mountain cherries, wild species with deeper colors and more varied shapes. They were planted by monks and pilgrims over many generations, each tree an offering to the mountain gods. There are now said to be 30,000 trees on the mountain's 4 zones of bloom. Because the mountain rises steeply, the zones bloom at different times. The lower slopes open first. Over the following weeks, the bloom climbs the mountain so that Yoshino offers a sustained spectacle that a flat park cannot. You can follow the blossoms uphill across 2 weeks, always arriving at peak bloom if you time it right. Yoshino was not only a pilgrimage site, it was briefly a capital. In the 14th century, Japan had two emperors simultaneously, the result of a disputed succession and a political crisis that split the court. One emperor held Kyoto. The other, Emperor Go-Daigo, fled to Yoshino with his loyalists and established what became known as the Southern Court. For 60 years, two courts claimed legitimacy. The cherry blossoms of Yoshino bloomed above the exiled emperor and his diminishing court year after year. The situation was eventually resolved, not cleanly, in 1392. The association of Yoshino with exile, longing, and the beauty of impermanence only deepened through this period. The poets who wrote about Yoshino after the 14th century wrote with all of this layered underneath: the monks, the pilgrims, the exiled emperor, the trees that had outlasted all of them. When Hideyoshi visited Yoshino in 1594, 4 years before his Daigo party, he brought 1,000 people and camped on the mountain for 5 days. The blossoms did not know who he was. The lower zone of Yoshino, called Shimo Senbon, the lower 1,000 trees, is where most visitors begin. You approach through a village of shops and guest houses that have been catering to pilgrims and flower viewers for centuries. The main street is narrow and steep. The buildings lean toward each other. On a peak day in April, the street is crowded in a way that requires patience. But above the village, the mountain opens. The path climbs through stands of wild cherry, not the uniform pale pink of the Some Yoshino, but a more varied palette. White trees next to pink ones. Older trees with gnarled trunks and branches that extend 40 or 50 years of growth over the path. Younger trees still finding their shape. By the time you reach the upper zones, Kami Senbon and Oku Senbon, the crowds have thinned. The air is cooler. The light between the trees is different from the light at the base of the mountain. You are somewhere else now, and the blossoms are here too. And between the trees there are views of the mountains beyond, also white with late-season cherry. At the center of Maruyama Park in Kyoto, there is a weeping cherry tree. It is very old and very large. Its branches extend outward and downward in the characteristic curtain of a Shiderezakura, the weeping cherry, and at night it is lit from below by lanterns so that it glows against the dark sky. It has been the subject of more photographs than can be counted. Maruyama Park sits beside the Yasuka Shrine, at the foot of the hills that lead up to Gion and the Eastern Temple districts. In cherry blossom season, it is full. Blankets cover the ground around every tree. The smell of food cooking, yakitori, takoyaki, corn on the grill, mixes with the smell of the blossoms, which is faint and sweet and easily lost in a crowd. The weeping cherry at the center has been here, in some form, for a very long time. The current tree is a descendant of an older tree that stood in the same spot. The park was laid out in the Meiji era, but the tradition of gathering at this place is older than the park. In the far north of Honshu, in Aomori Prefecture, there is a castle whose moat fills with petals. Hirosaki Castle is a small castle by the standards of Japanese castle architecture. The main keep is 3 stories, modest, white-walled, but it stands within a complex of moats and earthworks planted with more than 2,500 cherry trees, many of them old weeping cherries whose branches reach down to the water. When they fall into the moat. The moat fills with petals. They drift into a carpet, pale pink against the dark water, sometimes several centimeters deep. The castle tower is reflected in the water underneath the petals. Hirosaki blooms later than most of Honshu, sometimes as late April or early May, because Aomori is cold. Visitors who have already seen the blossoms in Tokyo and Kyoto come north to see them again. In a good year, you can follow the cherry blossom front north across the country for 5 or 6 weeks, never without blossoms. The people of Hirosaki have been doing this for a very long time. The castle has been here since 1611. Shinjuku Gyoen is a former imperial garden in the middle of Tokyo. It covers 58 hectares, a significant amount of space for a city of this density, and contains roughly 1,100 cherry trees of 65 different varieties. This variety is intentional. The garden was conceived partly as a research site for horticultural science, and the range of cherry species means that the bloom season at Shinjuku Gyoen extends from late February, when the early varieties open, to late April, when the last ones fall. Alcohol is prohibited inside the garden. This marks it out from most other Hanami locations, where sake is not merely permitted, but considered essential. Shinjuku Gyoen is, by Hanami standards, quiet. Families with children, tourists with cameras, people sitting on the grass eating bentos from the convenience store across the road. On the busiest days of peak bloom, the garden admits 20,000 people. The cherry trees do not notice. The Philosopher's Path is a canal-side walkway in the eastern part of Kyoto. It is named for the philosopher Nishida Kitaro, who is said to have walked it daily on his morning commute to Kyoto University in the early 20th century. Whether he walked it specifically for the cherry blossoms or simply because it was the route, the story has stuck. The path runs for roughly 2 kilometers alongside a narrow canal. Cherry trees line the canal on both sides. In full bloom, they form a tunnel of pale pink above the water, and the fallen petals drift along the canal below. It is not a quiet walk during Hanami. It is, in fact, usually quite crowded. But the scale of it, the low canal, the intimate width of the path, the closeness of the branches overhead, gives it a different quality from a park. You are inside it rather than looking at it. The blossoms are at shoulder height. You can reach out and touch them. Most people do not touch them, but knowing you could is part of it. The Japanese have a word for cherry blossoms viewed at night: yozakura, night sakura. In the dark, the blossoms are different. In daylight, they are pale and soft and slightly diffuse, a mass of color that is more impression than detail. At night, lit from below by lanterns or from above by floodlights, they become something else, vivid against the dark sky, each blossom defined, the branches black against the white and pink of the flowers. The major Hanami sites in Japan, the castle parks, the famous river banks, the shrine grounds, are lit during the blossom season. Paper lanterns, temporary floodlights, the lights of the food stalls that cluster around the edges of the viewing areas. The result is a kind of theatre. The blossoms performing differently for different audiences at different hours. There is a tradition at some of the most famous sites of Hanami continuing well into the night. The most committed viewers are still there at midnight, having arrived at noon, having eaten and drunk through the afternoon and evening. The blossoms are still there above them. The lanterns are lit. This feels, if you're there, like exactly the right way to do it. Hanami without food and drink is not really Hanami. The food is particular to the occasion. Sakura mochi, rice cake wrapped in a preserved cherry leaf with red bean paste inside. The leaf is edible, slightly salty and floral. Hanami dango, small round rice flour dumplings on a skewer, 3 colors, pink, white and green. Onigiri, bento boxes, anything that travels well and opens easily on a blanket. The drink is sake, Traditionally, though, beer and convenience store canned cocktails have long since joined the tradition. The sake is drunk warm in cold weather and cold in warm weather, poured into small cups and shared. It is, in the proper tradition of Hanami, not about getting drunk, though this happens, but about the particular ease of drinking outdoors under flowers in the early weeks of spring. The smell of sakura mochi and grilling food and spilled sake is, for most Japanese people, the smell of the season. It attaches to the memory of the blossoms in a way that is almost inseparable from them. You smell it and you're there. Every major cherry blossom site in Japan fills with blue tarps. They arrive in the morning, sometimes before dawn, held down by bottles of tea and boxes of convenience store food. Each tarp marks a territory. This is our spot, and we will be here, and we got here first. The system is understood by everyone and works more or less without policing. In the corporate culture of Japan, the job of reserving the spot has traditionally fallen to the most junior member of the office, the new hire, the youngest on the team, the person who cannot yet say no. They arrive at 7 in the morning to claim a patch of park that the rest of the team will not appear on until noon. They sit there with a thermos and a phone waiting. This is hazing, but it is also initiation. The person who holds the tarp is the person who makes the party possible. They are the most junior person and the most important person at the same time. Later in the evening, the same junior person is likely to be the last to leave, collecting the cups and the packaging. The blossoms do not care. They look the same from every direction. The connection between cherry blossoms and impermanence is not merely aesthetic. Buddhism entered Japan from the Korean peninsula in the 6th century, and with it came a formal philosophical vocabulary for something the Japanese had perhaps already sensed, that all things are transient, that attachment to the permanent is the source of suffering, that the beautiful and the brief are, in the deepest sense, the same thing. The cherry blossom became the natural symbol for this, not because anyone decreed it, but because the fit was exact. The tree is dormant for most of the year. It blooms for 2 weeks. The bloom is overwhelming. It ends. This is the arc of everything. The temples understood this. They planted cherry trees in their courtyards and on their hillsides, and along the paths their monks walked each morning. The blossoms fell on the grave markers and on the offering water and on the monks who were not looking at them. The impermanence was the lesson. The falling was the teaching. You did not need to be Buddhist to understand it. You just needed to stand under a tree. There is another Japanese aesthetic concept that the cherry blossom illuminates. Wabi-sabi is the acceptance, more than acceptance, the appreciation of imperfection and transience. The cracked glaze on a tea bowl, the unevenness of a handmade tile, the moss on a stone, the things that are imperfect and worn and will not last. The cherry blossom is not imperfect in itself. It is in full bloom, close to perfect in the way natural things sometimes are, but it is wabi-sabi in its relationship to time. It does not last. It could not last. Its beauty is inseparable from its brevity. The aesthetic traditions of Japan, the tea ceremony, the garden, the pottery, the flower arrangement, are all in their different ways engagements with this same awareness. The cherry blossom is the most public and democratic expression of something that runs through all of them. You do not need to know the word to feel what it describes. 2 weeks under the trees is usually enough. The falling of the blossoms has produced more Japanese poetry than almost any other single subject. The Minnyoshu, the Kokin Wakashu, The Hyakunin issue, every major anthology contains poems about the petals leaving the tree. The poems do not say simply that the blossoms fall and this is sad. They are more precise than that. They notice the particular direction the petals fall, the way they move in wind versus still air, the difference between the first petal to fall from a tree and the last. The haiku master Saigyo, who lived in the 12th century, wrote a famous poem expressing his wish to die beneath the cherry blossoms in spring under a full moon. He died on the 16th day of the second month of 1190, by some accounts, as close to cherry blossom season as any year allows. Whether the timing was deliberate or coincidental, the poem became, after his death, one of the most celebrated in the tradition. The wish to die well, in the right place, at the right moment, with the blossoms falling and the moon overhead, is the wish to have one's own ending be, at least in its setting, beautiful. The cherry blossom offered the possibility that even the last thing could be, in some sense, right. The cherry blossom has not always been used gently. In the decades leading up to and through the Second World War, the Japanese military state appropriated the symbolism of the blossom for purposes that were the opposite of contemplative. The brevity of the blossom, its falling, was mapped onto the brevity of a young soldier's life. To die for the emperor was to fall like a petal, beautiful, complete, at the right moment. The language appeared in propaganda, in military songs, in the letters that families received alongside the news of their sons' deaths. The blossoms were printed on aircraft fuselages. They appeared in the literature of the period as endorsements of sacrifice rather than meditations on loss. The pilots who flew from the Southern Islands in 1944 and 1945 on missions they did not return from flew with cherry blossom emblems on their planes and, sometimes, a sprig of cherry blossom in the cockpit. Whether they found comfort in this or were simply assigned it by the culture they had been raised in is a question that does not have a single answer. The Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, the controversial shrine to Japan's war dead, including convicted war criminals, is planted with hundreds of cherry trees. They bloom every spring. The question of what the blossoms mean there is one that Japan has not finished answering. After 1945, the cherry blossom had to be reclaimed. Not officially, there was no declaration, no policy. But the collective project of rebuilding Japanese society required finding ways to use the old symbols without their wartime associations. The cherry blossom was too central to Japanese identity to be abandoned. It had been there before the military period, and it would be there after. The post-war Hanami, the families gathering in the parks, the company picnics, the blue tarps and convenience store bentos, was, in part, a quiet insistence that the blossom was not only what the war had made it, it was also what it had always been, a sign of spring, an occasion for gathering, a reminder that things end and that this is not only loss. By the 1960s and 1970s, the parks were full again. The tradition had absorbed the war and continued. The blossoms were once more primarily a place to eat lunch outside and be glad that spring had come. The cherry trees at Yasukuni Shrine present a particular difficulty. The shrine is the subject of ongoing political controversy. Visits by senior Japanese officials are protested by China and South Korea, for whom the shrine's inclusion of Class A war criminals among its enshrined dead is not a historical abstraction. The controversy resurfaces every year, particularly around the spring equinox when officials sometimes visit. The cherry blossoms bloom regardless. The trees do not know what the shrine means to different people. They are old trees, planted long ago, and they respond to the temperature as all summer Yoshino respond. The Tokyo cherry blossom forecast uses a sample tree at Yasukuni Shrine, as one of its reference trees. When that tree blooms, the forecast is updated. It is a measure of how completely the blossom is woven into the practical and emotional life of the city, that the sample tree for the most watched seasonal forecast sits inside the most contested shrine in the country. The blossoms fall the same way there as everywhere else. Japan's convenience stores begin their cherry blossom preparations in February. The packaging turns pink. Sakura-flavored products appear. Sakura lattes, Sakura Kit Kats, Sakura chips, Sakura everything. The timing is calibrated to the forecast. The products arrive when the blossoms are 2 to 3 weeks away and remain until the petals have fallen. Then quickly they are replaced by the next season's palette. The Hanami economy extends well beyond the convenience store. Train companies run special cherry blossom viewing services. Hotels in cherry blossom districts charge peak season rates for the 2-week window of full bloom. Photography equipment sales spike. Dry cleaning services note an increase in jacket care as people prepare for outdoor gatherings. The festival that began as an imperial court occasion in the 8th century is now one of the most commercially significant seasonal events in the Japanese calendar. The blossoms have been many things over 1,000 years. Being good for business is among them. In recent years, the cherry blossom season has become Japan's most significant tourist event. Before the pandemic, the spring weeks in April drew millions of international visitors to Tokyo, Kyoto, and the other major blossom sites. Hotels were booked months in advance. Flight prices peaked. Tour operators built entire itineraries around the sakura front, moving groups from south to north to follow the bloom. The tourists arrived with cameras and confirmed what Japanese people had known for centuries. This is genuinely extraordinary. The sheer quantity of blossom, the scale of it, every tree in every park and along every river all flowering simultaneously, produces an effect that photographs approximate but do not capture. The problem of photography and the cherry blossom is well known. The blossoms photograph beautifully. They also photograph in some important way incompletely. What the photograph cannot capture is the density of the scent, the feeling of being inside a space that is briefly and completely transformed, the quality of the light passing through the petals from above. You have to go. In Japan, the school year begins in April. This is not a coincidence. When the Meiji government standardized the academic calendar in the late 19th century, it chose April for reasons that were partly administrative and partly connected to a long tradition of associating spring with beginnings. The cherry blossoms in a good year are at or near their peak in the first week of April when the new school year starts. The entrance ceremony, Nyugakushiki, typically takes place on a day when the blossoms are still on the trees. Families gather outside schools and universities for photographs. The children are in their best clothes. The trees are above them. In almost every family photograph from an April entrance ceremony, there are blossoms in the background. This means that for most Japanese people, the memory of starting school, the nervousness of a new beginning, the formality of the occasion, the particular smell of a spring morning is attached to the memory of cherry blossoms. They have been associated since childhood. The association does not need to be explained. In 1912, the mayor of Tokyo gave 3,000 cherry trees to the city of Washington. The gift was an act of friendship between the two countries, diplomatic in the formal sense, but also genuinely personal. The mayor at the time, Yukio Ozaki, and his wife had proposed the gift, and the American First Lady Helen Taft had supported it. The trees were Yoshino cherries and a weeping variety called Akebono. They were planted around the tidal basin, the artificial lagoon near the National Mall. They took some years to establish. When they bloomed properly, they produced in a city that already had strong connections to the idea of national symbolism through landscape, something that fit the place exactly. Washington now holds an annual National Cherry Blossom Festival each spring, drawing more than 1 million visitors to the tidal basin. The trees have been repropagated from original stock several times as they aged. New trees were sent from Japan in 1952 in a gesture of post-war reconciliation, and again in subsequent decades. The peak bloom in Washington is typically in late March or early April, roughly the same time as Tokyo. Two capital cities, 12,000 kilometers apart, watching the same tree bloom. The Japanese cherry blossom is now one of the most widely planted ornamental trees in the world. Botanical gardens from Berlin to Vancouver to Sydney plant them. They line streets in the Netherlands and Korea, and along the Yangtze River in China. The varieties are not always the Sumi Yoshino. Some regions use other varieties better suited to their climates, but the cultural import is consistent. These are Japanese cherry trees, and they bloom in spring, and people come to see them. Korea has its own deep cherry blossom tradition, partly shared with Japan through the colonial period, and partly predating it. The island of Jeju and the city of Jinhae hold festivals that rival those of Kyoto and Tokyo in scale. The relationship between Korean and Japanese cherry blossom culture is complicated by history, but the trees grow on both sides of the strait. What has traveled with the trees is not simply the aesthetic. It is also, more slowly and less completely, the concept. The idea that a bloom season is worth watching, that the brevity is the point, that 2 weeks of flowers justify travel, planning, and the clearing of a schedule. The Japanese cherry blossom has entered the visual language of art far beyond Japan. The ukiyo-e prints of Hiroshige and Hokusai, which circulated in Europe from the 1860s onward, and which influenced the Impressionists, particularly Monet and Van Gogh, frequently depicted cherry blossoms. The aesthetic that came with them, the flat planes of color, the interest in nature as subject, the willingness to center the transient moment, was absorbed into European painting in ways that are still visible. The cherry blossom appears in Western cinema, in fashion, in tattoo traditions that may or may not understand what they are borrowing. It appears as a symbol of Japan, in contexts that reduce it to decoration, and in contexts that approach what it actually means. In Japan, the artists who have worked with the blossom across 14 centuries understood something that their successors and imitators understand partially, that the blossom is not merely beautiful. It is an argument. It argues with great persistence and considerable charm that nothing lasts, that this is not a tragedy, and that the 2 weeks are worth having anyway. After the peak, the leaves come. At first they are small and tentative, a pale green that appears at the base of the blossoms and works outward. The blossoms are still present. Not all of them have fallen, but the tree is no longer only petals. It is becoming a tree again. The moment of pure blossom is ending. Most people find this part beautiful too, though it is a different beauty. The combination of white petals and young green leaves, backlit by spring sunlight, is a color combination that exists for a very short time. Photographers who have been working the peak bloom return to the parks for this. It does not look like the photographs they have been taking for the past 10 days. Within a week, the leaves have taken over. The blossoms are on the ground. The trees are green and ordinary looking, the kind of trees you would not notice in July. They will look like this for 8 months. People walk past them without stopping. They are saving their attention for next year. For 50 weeks of the year, the cherry tree does not perform. In summer, it is green and unremarkable. In autumn, its leaves yellow and fall, a modest autumn display compared to the maples, which are more dramatic in this season. In winter, it stands bare, its branches a dark network against the sky, its buds already forming but invisible unless you look closely. The tree waits. This is not a metaphor that requires elaboration, but it is one that the Japanese tradition has found useful. The long dormancy is part of what the bloom means. The 2 weeks of extraordinary beauty are preceded and followed by months of unremarkability. The ratio of blossom to year is very small. Perhaps this is the deepest reason why the forecasts are watched and the calendars are planned and the blankets are stored away ready. The window is brief. You know it is brief. And knowing it is brief makes it each time feel like something you almost missed. You did not miss it. This is a great luck. Many Japanese people return to the same tree or the same park every year. It is not always a conscious decision. Sometimes it is simply the park that is closest or the one the family has always gone to. But over years and decades a pattern forms. You have been to this tree before. You were here when you were young, and your parents were young, and the photographs from that day are somewhere in an album. The tree is the same tree. You are not the same person. This is obvious, but standing under the tree in April makes it specific in a way that abstract knowledge of the passage of time does not. The families who photograph themselves at the same spot each year, children growing, parents aging, grandparents gradually and then suddenly absent, are doing something that the Heian court poets understood, using the blossoms as a fixed point against which the movement of human lives becomes visible. The blossoms are the same. You are different. The difference is the year between. On the last day of the bloom, if you know it is the last day, the park looks different. The ground is deep in petals. The trees still hold some blossoms, not many, but enough to justify standing under them. The people who are here on this day tend to be the ones who came on the first day too, and on most of the days in between. They are not here by accident. There is a particular quality of attention that comes from knowing an ending is near. You look more carefully. You try, imperfectly, to remember what it looks like. You are already partly preparing for the 8 months of ordinary green that are coming. This is the most honest form of mono no aware. Not the thought of it, not the concept, but the actual experience of standing in a place that is beautiful and will not be this beautiful again for a year, knowing that you will be a year older when it comes back, knowing that time passes in exactly this direction and no other. The petals fall. You watch them. You have always watched them. You will watch them again. What has survived across 14 centuries of this tradition is not only the event itself, it is the insistence that the event matters, that 2 weeks of flowers in April are worth attending to with full attention, that a country of 125 million people setting aside time to go outside and watch trees bloom is not a frivolity, but something closer to a necessity. The Heian court poet, and the Edo-era commoner, and the office worker with a blue tarp on a Tuesday afternoon were doing the same thing, across the same centuries, for reasons that are difficult to fully articulate, but that have to do with something essential about human beings and their relationship to the seasons and to beauty that does not last. The tradition is not static. It has absorbed new foods, new products, new visitors, new political meanings, and shed some of them. But its center has held. Go outside, look at the trees, notice that they will not be like this for long. This is the whole instruction. It has been enough for a very long time. This year's blossoms are not last year's blossoms. This seems obvious, but the tradition depends on the experiencing of it as true. Each spring the blossoms open, and they are, in some way that matters, despite the genetic identity of the Somi Yoshino, different from the ones that opened before. The weather is different. The year that has passed is different. The people standing under the trees are different, incrementally, from the people who stood there the year before. The court poets who composed verses about the blossoms in the 9th century were the first people who had seen those particular blossoms on those particular trees. No one before them had stood in that garden, in that weather, on that afternoon. The blossoms we will see this year have also never been seen before. They will not be seen again. This is the argument the cherry blossom makes every spring to everyone who goes outside to watch it. It makes it patiently, without insistence, in the only language it has: 2 weeks of pale pink, a hanafubuki of falling petals, and then the long green year. The evening comes on slowly in cherry blossom season. The light changes in a way it does not change in other months. Something to do with the particular quality of spring light in the northern hemisphere, lower in the sky than summer, softer than winter's slant. It comes through the petals. When you look up into the canopy from below, the light is pink and white and slightly unreal. The parks begin to empty. The blue tarps are folded. The lanterns come on at the major sites, lit by the same people who lit them last year and the year before. The blossoms are the same in the lantern light as they were in the afternoon light, but they look different. Night Sakura. Somewhere a child is seeing this for the first time. Somewhere a very old person is seeing it, possibly for the last time, and knows this, and is watching carefully. The petals fall in the dark. They have been falling in April in Japan for 1,000 years. They will fall next year. They will fall long after everything else about this moment is gone. The lanterns are lit. Settle in.